Thank you for the nice introduction. I'm so happy to be here. So we've been sitting for a while, so just hear me out, okay? I like to do this because it's a topic of women's health, and a large majority of you are male. But it is a really important topic. So if you have a daughter, please stand up. If you have a sister, please stand up. If you have a mother, please stand up, or had a mother. And if you are a woman, please stand up. Okay, look around. It's a topic that is important to so many people. Okay, you can sit back down. Thank you. So I'm super honored to be here, and I thought to myself, what can I tell a room of the brightest minds about creatine that they don't already know? And creatine is just one small avenue of my research. So my hope is today that I also give some additional insight that you all can take back to your own labs and to stimulate more research questions. This is a topic that's super important and definitely underdeveloped, and so we will get into it. I do have the pleasure of serving on the Scientific Advisory Board, so thank you for that opportunity, as well as CREATE. And then I do, obviously, industry and NIH-funded research. Whoops, my timing didn't go here. So most importantly, what I wanted to start with is the thank you slide first. I would not be here if it weren't for my mentor, Dr. Jeff Stout. And I was thinking about, 10 years ago, I was not here. I think I was pregnant. But this idea that really science happens as a group, and I am so grateful for all of you that have collaborated with me, and to my mentor to teach me the way. I wouldn't be here if it weren't for him. And then I had the pleasure as a young scientist to meet Dr. Roger Harris. And I just wanted to share one thing that he taught me was he would sit down with me when I was the youngest scientist, and we could share ideas, and it was never a burden to him. And I really have carried that on. I'm getting emotional thinking about what he has taught me as a scientist to continue on and to mentor others, and that we all can learn from each other. So I will take that with me. And just a big thanks to my collaborators, and most importantly, my team. Research does not happen by a single individual, and so a big thanks to my group who has spearheaded some of this most recent creatine work, and then Dr. Paul Baker, who we heard from yesterday, helped with a few of the slides, and then Gabrielle Del Biondo helped with a couple of the figures for our pre-conference study, which I'll talk about today. Okay, so like I said, what do you not know about creatine in women? There's not that many papers, but what I want to share is a little bit about the past. There's more than you think. Social media is a funny thing that I don't particularly love, but you'll see some of our papers from Dr. Ellery and myself and that are reviews, and they're like, brand new paper, when in reality there are research studies of creatine in women from several years ago. And then I really want to identify some key female life targets and maybe some ways that we can do a better job of capturing women across the lifespan in our work. Okay, so interestingly, as I think back on my career, quite serendipitous, my very first published first author paper was creatine in women. I didn't really know it at the time. I mean, I did. But the interesting thing is, as we go through physiology, you're really not taught about female physiology. And then as you transition into midlife, they also don't teach you about midlife. And so when we think about this is my first study, and a couple things I wanted to mention, because the number one barrier for women to take creatine is weight gain. Well, back in 2007, creatine caused a little bit of weight gain, but it's about 0.8 kilograms, so less than a pound. I mean, that's like one day for me. Sorry, it's more than a pound, but you can see the variability. So it's really not causing much of a weight gain in women. And then we looked at a fatigue threshold, which when you look at the data, creatine is helping with delaying fatigue. And we continue to see that both in healthy populations, and Dr. Stout has really highlighted in older populations. So this is quite a long time ago, and we're still seeing some improvements with creatine. So it's not new, but what I wanted to highlight, and we had the ability to create a pre-conference submission, which is in review, to really highlight some of the timeline of creatine in women. So I know you can't really see this, but soon it will be published. And the very first study of creatine in women that I could find was in 1996. And you can see the trajectory here. The difference, though, that we start to see is that in these early studies, we didn't really know to capture or to account for menstrual cycle or hormone variability. And right now in this space, a lot of people will say, well, it's bad data. And I say, then you've never done science, because we are always learning of how to do it better. And we can really use this to help leverage what we need to continue to ask. And then we started to look at some, or reviews started to pop up. So first, thank you to our founding fathers. I had the best male mentors, and now I'm super happy to be able to continue this line and bring in more young females. And Dr. Joan Eckerson doesn't get enough attribution. She was a spearhead in the field and really created this initial work of creatine in women. And then I had to give a shout out to Dr. David Fukuda. He is at the University of Central Florida now, but my comrade during grad school. And that poster was creatine loading on gender and anaerobic running capacity. Again, something that we've been doing, but at the time never really thought, what is this difference between males and females, or females specifically? And we can really leverage that to say we need to look at women by themselves and account for different life stages. And then more recently, to many of the groups in the room here, we started to be able to look at females by characterizing different levels of hormones and the menstrual cycle. And we'll continue to do more, and obviously you just heard eloquently from Dr. Ellery about the importance of pregnancy. What you won't see up here, and we'll hear for a minute from Dr. Ann Brown about kind of the mental health space. One of the biggest voids is midlife. We currently have very little data on women in midlife, which I'll highlight. So just another shout out to Joan Eckerson, creating the first review. I just wanted to show this, that creatine in women, particularly active women, is going to improve performance. Things like VO2 max and fatigue threshold, increased strength power, increased lean mass, meaning it works for men and women. Does it work differently for women? It's still gonna work. But my hope is to show you a couple different things to consider. There might be some different targets. So not to give a ton of physiology lesson, but I don't know how much, like I teach ex-phys, and women are still considered a special population with one paragraph at the back of the book, when in reality we are more than 50% of the population. And so when we think about just key things about women, particularly when you add in exercise, women have more type 1 muscle fibers. We're more fatigue resistant. We have some differences in our cardiovascular system, particularly related to heart rate. Mitochondrial biogenesis, alterations in the mitochondrial energy. Obviously, we have a uterus, many of us. And then there's some differences in neuromuscular function. Some really fascinating changes to the brain across the menstrual cycle and into peri and postmenopause, and I think Anne's gonna talk about that a little bit. Some respiratory differences related to things like how we buffer and reactive oxygen species. Some fascinating differences with GI distress, which are particularly related to creatine. And then some vascular differences. So when we look at the physiological foundation of women, there are some key targets that creatine might tackle. And I say this of like, if you want some research questions, there's about 35 that I can think of. And when I say that is that there is so much work left to do, and the question is, does it work? And what's the risk to benefit ratio? But can we start to look at some of these mechanisms? And some of them have started, but then really thinking which of these might be really impacted by life stage and different hormonal controls. There are several different components. And even from yesterday, there was so much great data, and even some that chronic fatigue syndrome is more common in women. How do we maybe start to reframe it and think about it? What are some key targets that we can specifically address for females? Because they need information delivered slightly different. So some creatine potential across the lifespan, cellular hydration, sport performance, lean mass, and sleep, which we'll hear about next. Prenatal, we heard several eloquent approaches there. And then a little bit longer in the lifespan, I'm gonna talk about this here in a minute, some key targets that creatine could be really important for in this midlife and into postmenopause. All right, so I guess my animations fell apart a little bit, but when we think about the menstrual cycle, which Sam so eloquently talked about yesterday, there are some key physiological changes across the cycle, which really laid the foundation for why we started to look at menstrual cycle changes with creatine, or at least to see how that impacts it. So estrogen promotes changes in vasodilation, ventilation, heart rate, cellular changes, metabolism, and even the ability or inability to recruit motor units and create that force. So when we look at all of these targets, creatine can actually impact many of these. And so one other element that I wanted to say was some of the brain work. This is not an area of expertise for me, but something I'm fascinated with, particularly as we look at changes in mental health and anxiety and depression over time, is that actually in the brain, creatine is used as a control in many of the brain scans. But the crazy thing is that it actually changes across the menstrual cycle. And most brain experts don't account for the menstrual cycle in their measurements. And so it's a really big opportunity to bridge both fields to say, okay, really, what is happening? And then when we look at some of these changes, things like emotional regulation, cognitive pictures and thoughts, a lot of those side effects are from the menstrual cycle and hormonal changes that maybe has a relationship with creatine and creatine supplementation. Okay, so just a little bit of menstrual cycle physiology here to put this in perspective. A lot of people, everywhere I go, say it's really hard to study women. They don't want to participate, and oh, what about the menstrual cycle? And I would say maybe it's our lab, maybe because we're cool women, but we have so many women that want to participate, and they're really invested in science. The hard part is that the variability across cycles is so high. That picture I showed you previously, most women's menstrual cycle does not look like that. And so I just wanted to show there are big changes in estrogen and progesterone that is quite variable between women. So the question is, well, how do we do it and how do we start to account for it? And even in one individual, there is quite high variability. Meaning from 1 month to the next month, you may or may not ovulate, you may have high spikes of estrogen and progesterone, and so how do we account for that in research, particularly as we're trying to target or understand what's happening? So I guess my picture didn't show up. A big shout out to Katie Hirsch at the University of South Carolina, one of my former PhD students who's really trying to narrow this down of how does it work and how do we measure it. And so, oh, there we go. Okay, so just one other thought is into perimenopause. Average onset of perimenopause in the US is 42. Goes to 51 years old into postmenopause, which is a single point in time. So between, and even in the US, we're seeing symptoms of perimenopause start as early as 38 years old. And so when we really think about that 10 to 12 year gap, there is so much under-research, or no one's reporting those hormonal changes, partly because they are so variable. So not only is it hard to capture in the lab, let's think about all these women. Every day is a new day, highs and lows, but I would say arguably the most important life stage of numerous health impacts that are changing, and something that creatine and lifestyle can be really important for. So one of the things we're doing with Dr. Katie Hirsch is how do you measure it? With new technology, there's 2 devices that we're using for at-home daily trackers to allow us to look at things like estrogen, progesterone, FSH, and LH at a daily level so that we can accumulate that data to account for our single point in time measurements. And I'll just show you this from the Anito data. Pretty fascinating is you can get this daily variability. Then you can account for the day of testing or the multiple days of testing to see how those hormones are changing. And so it really raises the playing field for us to characterize female health characteristics and hormones on those days of testing or that variability throughout the day, and really use some of that AI modeling to account for that. So stay tuned, but these are very affordable methods that allow us and have allowed us to track and understand ovulation and kind of day of testing measurements. Another element I would say as some takeaways, if you're doing research, we'll want to include women and at a minimum start to characterize the participant information. So many studies we don't know, are they naturally menstruating? Are they on hormonal contraception? Do they have a period? How long? And then even into perimenopause. As a minimum, track ovulation and basal body temp or at-home app. Can you add blood hormones? Sometimes, like I showed, the variability might not be worth it, depending on the budget. And then the daily urine hormones we have found to be particularly helpful and cost efficient to be able to do that. And then here's a questionnaire that we developed, and happy to share it with all of you. We do it on Qualtrics of just how do you characterize the sample so that we can do a better job when publishing to just give more about the sample, opposed to not every study needs to have all of these detailed components controlled for. So let's look at some creatine in women, some new highlights. So I didn't want to come here and just talk about the papers we've already published, but this one I was able to be a collaborator on, so thank you. And I really wanted to highlight this midlife number. Our adult women had one of the lowest consumptions of dietary creatine, which to me says ding, 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 opportunity. This is also the group of women that are desperate for help, and they are the CEOs of their household. They're making all of the purchasing. And so I say that is that we have the ability to impact this life stage and the generations behind, because we're the ones that are buying all the things. And then you can see if we can help them in adulthood, it can help them through into postmenopause. So big opportunity, and there's some early data to show that it's related. Dietary creatine is related to normal menstrual cycles, infection, hysterectomies, et cetera, meaning we need more exploration, but the low-hanging fruit here for potential of opportunity. And then we have published this data, but I just wanted to show, as we start to control for menstrual cycle, the benefits of creatine become more apparent, particularly in the luteal phase. So the luteal phase is the latter half of the menstrual cycle, usually when women are not feeling their best. What we have identified is women are going to perform at any given time in the menstrual cycle, but there are some added challenges, both qualitatively, et cetera. But creatine might help with that optimal performance, particularly in that luteal phase. And a research question for you all, what we're also trying to tackle, is what happens in the recovery phase. If you have an Olympic athlete trying to compete during her cycle, she will compete, but then how does it impact recovery? And so that's a big area that needs to be explored. And then I wanted to highlight a couple of our recent papers and some new data to show that there's even more to evaluate, particularly with some of the fluid changes. So this is a paper that was published by Sam Moore that we looked at both normal menstruating and hormonal contraceptive users across the menstrual cycle. After a 5-day, 20-gram loading phase, and they were randomized to start in either the follicular or low hormone phase or the luteal phase, and looked at some of the fluid changes. So total body water, and this to me was a really important study because most women are worried about weight gain and water gain. And as we saw yesterday is like, well, if it's actually causing water gain, that's not a bad thing, can be helpful for hydration. But we showed that in that luteal phase, the pre-post creatine supplementation significantly increased total body water. You can see the placebo group went down. Why this is important is usually in the luteal phase, as we saw yesterday, is there's an increased edema. We carry more water extracellularly. And so the question was, okay, is it increasing fluid, and where is that fluid going? Was really the important question. So when we look at extracellular fluid, the space that makes us feel a little extra puffy, you know, the women in the room, creatine actually helped or caused a slight increase in extracellular fluid, but caused an even greater increase in intracellular fluid. So what that told us is it was actually helping to pull the fluid from the extracellular space into the cell, which is really great theoretically. This led to about 12 more research questions, and so here they are, or at least one low-hanging fruit, is then how would this impact things like thermoregulation, which we know changes across the menstrual cycle, and how would it impact performance, particularly in a heat stress environment? The signs say that it probably would be really helpful. And then, so what we saw was an increase in total body water and no change in body weight. And this study, Sam briefly presented it yesterday. It was about 1/2 pound. Again, when controlling for the menstrual cycle, which we did not do in my study in 2007, some of those weight changes that we saw were likely from the menstrual cycle. Now we're seeing very little change when you control for some of that natural variability. And then I just wanted to reiterate some of what Sam presented yesterday of looking at this same idea, follicular versus luteal phase with phase angle. It feels like I planted Dr. Stout's comment yesterday, but I didn't, of can phase angle be really valuable in understanding is creatine working? I think it's even more valuable with the menstrual cycle because of that cellular integrity, and it's really easy and really kind of available. So a key finding here is that regardless of the menstrual cycle, creatine impacted or increased in phase angle. And then particularly in that luteal phase, there was a greater increase in phase angle in the creatine group compared to the placebo group. So those small changes could be really valuable to show greater cellular hydration and integrity. And then counter movement jump. I think the performance stuff is kind of boring, sorry y'all, but it's still gonna benefit performance. It's really starting to ask why and how can those performance benefits translate to other kind of more impactful quality of life outcomes. So then to see that increase in phase angle is showing to be pretty impactful, which to me then sets the foundation for some of our midlife evaluations. Okay, well then how does that impact some more of our chronic diseases and some of the women that maybe are dealing with those midlife hormonal changes? The other thing it led me to ask is so my colleague Dr. Ann Brown had some data of 5 grams daily with compared to a placebo with resistance training and across the menstrual cycle, so 6 weeks. Another component here that we study a lot is body composition, and oftentimes, as Darren mentioned yesterday, DEXA is not super sensitive to a lot of our interventions, but when you add a total body water component, particularly like phase angle, it can start to give you a lot more about how those muscle changes and what's happening. And so I said to Ann, hey, can I peek at your data? And can we compare the 5 gram daily dose that a lot of people are recommending now compared to the loading dose, which is really helpful to use in a research component, but many women don't want to load. And the data was pretty interesting. So not published yet, but we're going to spin it up after this weekend. So most importantly, there was no change in weight from the 5 gram daily. And interestingly, so this is pre-post resistance training, the placebo actually saw a pretty big increase in weight gain. And then someone might think, well, that of course came from the resistance training. But when you look at the data, this part is published, it's mostly fat mass. And then when you look at the creatine group, although there's no weight change, they saw a pretty good increase in lean mass and a slight decrease in fat mass from that 5 grams daily. So even more potential research questions here on different dosing protocols in our females. So looking at that total body water component here, creatine saw a 3-liter increase compared to placebo. So obviously some improvements in cellular hydration even from that 5 grams daily. And then closer look at phase angle, you're seeing a 1.3 degree increase compared to our loading of a 0.37. And so 2 things are happening here, is that some of this is coming from the lean mass changes from resistance training, but you can see that it's quite significant. The p-value isn't, and we can talk a different day about p-value, but this to me is very clinically meaningful and leads to more research questions. So creatine increases phase angle, placebo no change, and then with some of the intracellular and extracellular fluid, seeing some of the similar changes. I don't have the mean values up there, but it actually was quite large of that extracellular moving into the intracellular. So much potential even from those low doses. And then Paul presented this yesterday. I just want to, whoops, I don't know what happened to my animation. Just potential for creatine to impact blood flow, particularly due to those vascular changes. So more clinical applications with those cellular hydration could be a really important target. All right, so a new era for creatine, particularly in midlife. So another setting the stage here is, I don't know, I won't make you identify if you're in perimenopause, but it is quite the time. And most women don't know when they're in it because no one tells us about it. And it's huge changes in hormone variability. The interesting thing, particularly for everyone in the room, is that most people talk about estrogen and progesterone and hormone therapy, when in reality, testosterone is a really important picture. And even if a woman is taking hormone therapy, lifestyle behaviors are so important for all of the physiological changes. And so things like creatine with resistance training, especially on things like bone, so much opportunity for this space to help these women. We see changes in vascular health, significant increased risk for heart disease, a loss of muscle, bone and joint pain, increase in fat mass, and changes in brain. If I say all of this, my hope is all of you are thinking, wow, actually creatine has been shown to target all of those things in other ages. And so much opportunity here. Oh my gosh, my animations. Okay, well, what I was going to show you is a lot of our work has really tried to say what's happening in this life stage. I used to think it was linear. As we got older, we would gain fat and lose muscle, and there's a lot of things we can do about that. I actually think of it as a challenge. But what we were seeing is that it's kind of more like a cliff. From pre to perimenopause, we see big drops in lean mass, increases in fat mass, and even changes in things like protein turnover and our ability to use amino acids. And so we did a study most recently to look at women across a 2-year time frame, and we're seeing that over those 2 years, after we've seen some changes, is there's significant decrease in muscle size and quality, decrease in RMR, and a decrease in bone, even in our midlife women. And so when you think about it, it's really that cliff we want to target. There's actually some really great postmenopausal data that Darren and his group have spearheaded, but it's that midlife that we want to look at. The other thing I want to mention, this came up yesterday, is that brain activity significantly changes. The interesting thing, though, is from pre to perimenopause is a brain fog. I like to think I always have about 20 squirrels running in my head, and if I can calm them, it's a good day. And creatine actually helps with that. It helps me with that, I should say. The interesting thing, into menopause, things calm down. Actually, those brain changes tend to go away. So even more opportunity for those that are studying cognition and sleep, etc. It's a perfect window of opportunity. And then, more importantly, most women suffer from a number of symptoms. And we're trying to understand, well, what are some characterizations of that? And one of the studies that we found was against our hypothesis a little bit, was that body fat actually predicted the majority of symptoms. So women that have higher body fat had higher symptoms. But interestingly, on the positive side, women that participated in vigorous exercise actually had lower total menopausal symptoms, and so more power to some exercise. But I think there's probably some things related to kind of the ability to cool ourselves and being used to that hot. I had a woman say like hot flashes were very empowering to her. I'm just going to own that with those symptoms. All right, so then here is a study we are about to start, and I wanted to end with this because let's collaborate. There is no sense for each of us across the world doing the same study, and my hope is that we literally held off on starting it so that, hey, is there an outcome that we could add that would benefit one of you? Especially, I like to think I've been successful finding funding. I have never yet found funding for a creatine study by itself, but there's so much potential. So how do we use our resources to have an impact? And so right now, this is what we have planned of creatine and placebo in a control group in perimenopausal women, but we wanted to make the inclusion criteria quite broad. Most women are never diagnosed with perimenopause. There's just a number of symptoms that they're dealing with. And so being able to capture women with at least 2 menopausal symptoms in this age frame, because we are seeing it happen younger and younger, a pretty wide BMI. And for the first time, we're actually allowing individuals that are on hormone therapy because it's becoming more and more common so that we can start to account for some of those changes. And then has risk for chronic disease. We want women that could be benefited from 6 weeks of resistance training with and without creatine. And then a couple of our outcomes here. So we're going to have a 5-day, 20-gram dose loading run-in. So some pre-post measurements there to see what happens just with the loading phase. Followed by, and here's our outcomes, muscle quality and protein turnover, some metabolism, and we're seeing some changes with metabolic flexibility and inability to utilize fat when needed in our midlife, so we'll be evaluating that. Our strength outcomes, and then using some brain oxygenation and cognitive outcomes. Especially after yesterday, my hope is maybe to look at some D3 creatine cost, so just we can maybe build our heads there. So pre-post a loading phase, and then looking at, here's just our outcomes, as well as then after the loading phase, 6 weeks of resistance training with creatine, 5 grams a day, or with placebo, 5 grams a day. And so here's all of our outcomes. And then, here's our second half here. So let's collaborate. If you have ideas, happy to add anything. Part of why I am still in the trenches is to build lots of data and love to create new science. So if you have ideas that you want to add, happy to add them. So then my last thought I wanted to leave you with, and I actually had this before we ended it yesterday, but I think one of the key opportunities is to combine creatine with other ingredients, particularly for women. Because they are really the purchasers of dietary supplements. So I think for menstrual cycle symptom support, it's a huge area of need. More than 70% of women complain of dysmenorrhea or menstrual cycle pain. And when you think about a lot of the ingredients we deal with, it could be really helpful. Creatine and omega-3, creatine and electrolytes could be valuable, particularly in that luteal phase. Fatigue, one of the most common symptoms that women in perimenopause complain about. So maybe creatine combined with these ingredients. Particularly, I think the adaptogens could have a lot of potential interesting applications. And then muscle mass, so I think creatine by itself is great. Obviously, if you can add resistance training, we're trying to look at combined with EAAs, but I think the synergies with H-B would be really fascinating, particularly in that mid to late life. And then joint and bone health. We saw some of that bone aspect there, but why are we not adding other ingredients? Or I just make my own cocktail. And then it didn't really fit in a category, but I'm a huge fan of magnesium as it relates to sleep and really every metabolic function. And what we know is as women age, estrogen reduces our ability, or the low estrogen reduces our ability to absorb magnesium, so it becomes even more important for midlife. And then we haven't talked a lot about GI distress, but a lot of women in midlife say, creatine does cause some GI pain. And what I tell them, they didn't tell me to say this, but usually Creapure is the one thing that doesn't. And so creatine monohydrate, but Creapure actually tends to be easier on the gut of women. So summary, include women if you're not, and at a minimum start to characterize their hormonal landscape, even if it's a questionnaire, can be really valuable. I think midlife is an optimal target, and there's such little data. And then let's work together. Like, why are we doing all of the same things across the world? That's why we all come together. So thank you.